The army truck bounced along the dusty road, its canvas sides flapping in the warm wind of the Nebraska plains. Inside, the German prisoners sat in silence, staring at the dry fields, the endless fences, and the summer sun that shimmered over rows of corn and sugar beets. These men, once soldiers under Rommel in North Africa, had crossed oceans and continents only to find themselves in the middle of farmland that looked almost suspiciously familiar. They were ready for hostility, ready to be treated like enemies, but what they found confused them far more than hatred ever could. As the truck rattled past mailboxes and barnyards, something caught their attention: names. Not just American ones like Johnson or Smith, but names from home: Müller, Schmidt, Schneider. One man leaned forward, squinting to read a mailbox. It said Bauer. Another saw Kruger painted on a silo. Whispers spread across the truck bed. Those were German names. Not just German, personal, intimate, even ancestral. It was as if the war had played a trick on them, folding time and space so that Bavaria and Nebraska somehow overlapped. The prisoners looked at each other, unsure what to think. Could it be coincidence? Or were they now working for distant relatives, descendants of men who had left the old country long before the war? One prisoner thought of his uncle, who had disappeared from his village in 1905 and was rumored to have gone to America. Was it possible he now labored on his land? The familiarity of it all was unsettling. These were not the faceless Americans from propaganda posters. These were farmers who bore the same names, who plowed the same kind of soil, and who, by the look of it, lived the same quiet, rural life the prisoners had once known themselves. Even the barns looked right: sturdy, red, practical, with big double doors and the smell of livestock lingering in the air. The guards, seated at the rear of the truck with rifles across their laps, showed no reaction. To them, this was just another work detail. But for the prisoners, it was a confrontation with memory. The further the truck drove, the more they recognized. An orchard like the one behind the baker's house in Württemberg. A windmill identical to one near Düren. The shape of a stone well that matched the one in a village square they hadn't seen in years. Some tried to ignore it. They turned their eyes to the floor or stared blankly into the distance, focusing on the idea of survival, on ration schedules and fatigue and duty. But others couldn't help it. They were being reminded, painfully, unavoidably, of who they had been before the war. Boys in farmhouses, sons of blacksmiths, grandsons of men named Keller and Burmer, who had worked fields like these long before uniforms and weapons ever touched their hands. The moment that crystallized the strangeness came when the truck slowed at a crossroads. A family stood at the fence watching them pass. The father wore overalls and rested one hand on the gate. The mother shaded her eyes. The boy, perhaps 6 years old, held a baseball glove and waved. One prisoner raised his hand in return before dropping it quickly, uncertain whether the gesture was allowed. That second of eye contact, of recognition, lingered. Inside the truck, no one spoke. But the silence was no longer just about fear or discipline. It was about something deeper, more disorienting. The realization that, on the other side of the war, there were people who looked like them, spoke like them, and bore their names. People who might not be enemies at all. The truck rolled on, but something had shifted, something they would not be able to unsee. At Fort Robinson, routine replaced chaos. The prisoners woke each morning to the clang of a bell, washed in metal sinks lined against the barracks wall, and reported for roll call in neat rows. The air was dry and still, broken only by the sound of boots on gravel and the rustle of canvas as trucks were loaded. For many, the structure was a strange comfort, something to hold on to after the confusion of surrender and the voyage across the Atlantic. They weren't free, but they weren't hunted either. Their war, at least for now, was suspended. Each morning, some were assigned to kitchen duty or maintenance, But others, especially the stronger men, were sent to nearby farms. The truck rides became a new normal. The same countryside, the same rows of corn, the same familiar names on mailboxes and barns. At first, it was just a curiosity, but as the days passed, it began to gnaw at them. These weren't isolated names, they were everywhere. During those rides, memories stirred in places long buried. One man, a farmer's son from near Dresden, remembered helping his father plant sugar beets in the spring. Another thought of his family's apple orchard, how they used to wrap the fruit in cloth to protect it during harvest. In Nebraska, the trees were different, but the work looked the same. The rhythm of farm life was universal. Plant, tend, harvest. In that rhythm, they found echoes of home. The strangeness was not just in the landscape, but in the people. The farmers who greeted the prisoners with short nods or glanced at them over fences didn't seem like enemies. They didn't spit or shout. Some even looked at the Germans with a kind of quiet curiosity, as if seeing something more than a uniformless captive. They saw men with the same sunburnt faces, the same calloused hands, the same weariness in their shoulders. At first, the prisoners were careful not to look too closely. They knew the rules. No wandering, no speaking unless addressed, no contact beyond what was required. But inevitably, eyes met. A farmhand smiled once while loading hay. A farmer's wife brought water without a word, but with a gentleness that made one prisoner blink in surprise. These brief exchanges weren't allowed, but they weren't resisted either. Some prisoners began to talk at night in the barracks. Not openly, not loudly, but in whispers, about the work, the land, and the people. They asked each other whether the man named Bauer they saw today might be a cousin, whether the woman at the well reminded them of an aunt left behind. The questions weren't meant to be answered. They were simply thoughts that refused to stay buried. Not all prisoners welcomed the familiarity. For some, it was painful. It felt like a betrayal, that the enemy should be so much like them. One man stared at a barn marked Müller and muttered that he wished he hadn't seen it. Better to face an unknown foe than one that wears your grandfather's name. Others felt the irony cut even deeper. They had fought to defend their homeland, only to be laborers for strangers who might have shared their blood. The paradox grew heavier with each passing day. These men were not just soldiers anymore. They were displaced souls, caught between the country they had left behind and a land that, against all logic, reminded them of it. Their bodies worked the fields, but their minds wandered. Nebraska was not home, and yet it wasn't entirely foreign either. And that in-between place was harder to survive than the war itself. It began with a gesture so small that no one expected it to matter. On a hot afternoon, while the prisoners were thinning rows of sugar beets under the punishing sun, a little girl appeared at the edge of the field. She was barefoot, a ribbon in her hair, and she watched the Germans with wide, curious eyes. Without hesitation, she raised her hand and waved. The prisoners froze. One of them, moved by something he didn't fully understand, lifted his hand and returned the gesture before quickly lowering it. The guards noticed, but said nothing. There was no alarm, no reprimand, just a flicker of tension in the air. Then it passed. The girl skipped away, back to the farmhouse, her small presence leaving a weight behind. The prisoners continued working, but now something had shifted. That brief moment had pierced a barrier none of them knew could be touched. More moments followed in the days ahead, just as quiet, just as powerful. A farmer's wife walked out with a pitcher of water and placed it down carefully without meeting anyone's eyes. A local contractor greeted the men with a faint nod and didn't flinch when one accidentally brushed past him. One old farmer, hearing a prisoner hum an old hymn, paused and listened rather than walk away. These were not open acts of friendship, but they were not acts of hatred either. Each time it happened, it shook the men. They had been trained to see Americans as the other, as invaders, destroyers, a force to resist. But now they were being offered water on hot days. They were receiving lunchboxes filled with more food than they'd seen during their last months of service. Thick slices of bread, slices of ham, apples, even cookies. It wasn't what they had expected from captivity. It wasn't punishment. It wasn't cruelty. It was care. Routine, regulated, but undeniably humane. The contradiction gnawed at them. How could the enemy feed you like this? How could they treat you with restraint, even dignity, while back home their cities were bombing yours? At night, lying in bunks under the tin roofs of the barracks, they didn't speak of it openly, but they thought about it constantly. For some, it was comforting. For others, it felt like manipulation. But for all, it was deeply unsettling. Some began to see the farmers not as symbols of war, but as men. They watched the way the Americans walked through their fields, checked the fences, called their dogs. They looked at their houses, small, clean, busy with work. They noticed children doing chores, wives tending gardens. It reminded them of home in a way that was unbearable. This wasn't the enemy they'd imagined. This was something far more complicated. Even among themselves, the prisoners didn't agree on what these moments meant. A few remained bitter, insisting it was all a trick. Others said nothing, unsure what to believe. But there were those who began to soften, if only a little. Not out of loyalty to America, but out of recognition of humanity, the shared patterns of life that transcended borders. One prisoner, walking back to the truck at the end of the day, turned to his companion and said softly, almost in disbelief, that the land smelled like his grandfather's fields. The soil, the air, even the wind felt familiar. The other man nodded. They didn't say more. They didn't need to. The realization had already settled. They were working among people who could have been their neighbors, if not for an ocean, if not for a war. As the days stretched into weeks, the names became impossible to ignore. Every mailbox, every barn, every silo they passed seemed to whisper reminders of home. Schneider, Müller, Keller. These were not foreign to the prisoners. They were the names of old classmates, bakers, schoolteachers, neighbors. Each one cut like a blade, not because they were American, but because they weren't supposed to exist here. They were supposed to belong to Germany, to a life left behind. For some, the repetition began to feel like a taunt. It was as if the land itself was mocking them, showing how people with their names had thrived while they had suffered through war. They had fought for a homeland that now lay in ruins, while these American Germans plowed rich fields under open skies. It was hard not to resent that. One prisoner stared at a whitewashed barn bearing the name Hoffman and clenched his jaw, remembering the neighbor who once brought fresh milk to his childhood home. But even resentment didn't silence the questions. Around the barracks at night, the conversations shifted. What if those families had come from the same villages? What if someone across the field was a distant cousin? Could it be that they shared blood with the people they now served under guard? The possibility was unnerving, and for some, deeply painful. It blurred the already fading line between us and them. Not every man reacted the same way. Some hardened. They accused the immigrants of betrayal, abandoning the fatherland for safety and prosperity. To them, these names on American soil were proof of disloyalty, of weakness. One corporal, a scar still fresh across his temple, warned the others not to be fooled. Just because the names matched didn't mean the people did. The farmers were still the enemy, he insisted, nothing more. But others could no longer hold to that black and white view. A young soldier named Dieter, whose brother had died on the Eastern Front, looked at the fields and wondered aloud if this was the life his family could have lived, if only they'd left before the war. His words silenced the room. No one argued. everyone understood the weight behind them. What disturbed the men most wasn't that America had German names. It was that America had made something of them. These names had not been erased or shamed. They had been painted proudly on barns and signs, woven into the landscape. And that forced the prisoners to face an even harder truth. The path they had followed, of loyalty, sacrifice, and war, had led to ruin, while another path had led here. Every time they hoed a row or hauled a crate past a building bearing a familiar name, the contradiction hit them again. This wasn't propaganda, it wasn't fantasy, it was real, and it hurt, because it made them wonder whether they had been wrong, not just in action, but in belief. What if freedom had always been across the ocean, painted in black letters on a mailbox? As the season deepened, the realization sank in. These weren't just American names. They were reflections. They were mirrors held up to the past and to the futures they might have had. Futures lost to war, to ideology, to choices that could never be undone. The names on the land didn't just remind them of who they were. They reminded them of who they would never be. The longer the prisoners worked the Nebraska fields, the more they felt the eyes of the townspeople following them. Not everyone welcomed the sight of German soldiers, even unarmed, moving through their communities. For many American families, the war was still painfully present. Sons were overseas, some already lost, some still fighting across France or in the Pacific. Seeing men who wore the enemy's face working calmly among the crops felt like an insult to those sacrifices. Whispers spread, and the tension grew. Rumors began to circulate after two prisoners were seen lingering near a fence, quietly observing a distant farmhouse. In truth, they had only been trying to read the family name painted on the mailbox. But by the time the story reached town, it had transformed into a tale of planned escape. Some claimed the men were plotting to steal a truck and flee south. Others said they'd tried to make contact with local Germans. None of it was true, but the damage was done. The guards tightened security, and farmers began locking barns at night. For the prisoners, the change was palpable. Where once they had received brief nods or quiet tolerance, now they felt a coldness return. Women walking past the work sites clutched their children more tightly. Teenagers stared with folded arms. Older men shook their heads and muttered under their breath. Even the dogs seemed less friendly. It wasn't hatred. They'd known that feeling before. This was something quieter, but more corrosive. Distrust, sharpened by grief. Yet even within that climate, complexity remained. One farmer, John Kruger, had lost a nephew in France. He had resisted using POW labor until the harvest became too much to handle. When the prisoners arrived at his farm, he kept his distance, issuing instructions through a contractor. But one day, while walking the fields, he heard one of the Germans quietly singing a Lutheran hymn his own family sang every Sunday. It caught him off guard. He paused. For a brief second, he saw the man not as an enemy, but as someone raised in the same faith, someone who might have grown up under a different flag, but the same sky. Small moments like this occurred again and again. A guard leaned on his rifle during a break and heard a prisoner describe Africa, not in terms of battle, but of sand and silence and thirst. Another prisoner, bent over a row of beets, murmured about the bread his mother used to bake back home. These weren't calculated conversations. They slipped out when no one was trying to persuade or explain. And when they did, something softened, if only for a moment. The food remained a silent symbol of contradiction. At noon, cardboard boxes were handed out, sandwiches, fruit, milk, cookies. The prisoners often paused before eating, not out of discipline, but disbelief. During the final weeks in Tunisia, they had survived on dry rations and bitter water. Now they bit into soft bread with slices of ham and real mustard. It didn't feel like enemy rations. It felt like something more dangerous: kindness. Some of the men joked that captivity in Nebraska was better than freedom back home. Others warned them not to grow comfortable. One corporal barked that this was how you lost your edge, how you forgot who you were. But even he couldn't deny the reality in front of them. They were being fed, housed, and worked, not tortured or humiliated. It didn't fit with the image of the enemy they had been given. Still, trust was fragile. One wrong move, one misinterpreted glance, and it could all collapse. The guards knew this. The prisoners felt it. But as the days went on, the space between suspicion and sympathy grew more complicated. They were no longer just prisoners. They were reminders, walking reminders of a war that had reached into every home, every heart, and yet still allowed enough room for a shared hymn, a shared meal, a shared silence in the fields. By the end of summer, the Nebraska landscape had settled into a familiar rhythm. The fields had been worked, the hay stacked, the harvest mostly gathered. But what lingered in the minds of the German prisoners was not the rows of crops or the dust on their boots. It was the mirror they saw each day. A mirror made of names, gestures, accents, and unexpected kindness. A reflection of themselves in the lives of those they were told were their enemies. And no matter how hard they tried, they couldn't look away. The truck rides back to Fort Robinson were quieter than ever. Not from fatigue alone, but from the weight of realization. One man stared out the back of the truck at a barn painted with the name Schroeder and whispered that it could have belonged to his uncle if things had turned out differently. Another said nothing but clutched a letter from home, its words blurred with grief and uncertainty. The war was ending. That much they knew. But what kind of home would they return to? Some prisoners began to fear the return more than the captivity. In Nebraska, they had been fed, treated with civility, and allowed moments of calm. Back in Germany, there would be rubble, rationing, and loss. Cities like Hamburg and Dresden were no longer cities, they were ruins. Farms had been stripped, families displaced, futures shattered. And still, across the ocean, in fields that looked like their own, men named Müller and Schmidt were raising children, repairing tractors, building lives in peace. It was that contrast that cut the deepest. The fact that some Germans had escaped the collapse, not by fleeing the war, but by leaving long before it began. These American farmers were the proof that another path had been possible. They had carried their language, their customs, their names across the Atlantic and had grown something new from old roots, something that didn't require uniforms or orders or flags, just land, labor, and time. One prisoner, Ernst, a former school teacher, began to write down the names he saw in the mailboxes. He wasn't sure why. Maybe to remember? Maybe to map a family tree he would never finish. Others carved initials into bunk slats, into fence posts, into their memory. Not as rebellion, but as preservation. A way of holding on to the strange truth they had found in the heart of the enemy's country. Farewells were quiet. When the war ended and repatriation began, most prisoners left without ceremony. A few farmers shook hands. One offered a photograph of the farm. Another handed a folded piece of paper with an address. Technically, these exchanges were against regulation, but they happened anyway. The rules couldn't stop what had already happened in the minds of those men. Years later, some of them wrote back. Letters from destroyed towns, describing ruined streets and broken homes. Others didn't write, but remembered. They told their children about the barns with their names, about the sandwich lunches, about the girl who waved from the fence. They didn't glorify captivity, but they didn't deny what they had seen. That, in a time of violence, a field in Nebraska had shown them something they weren't supposed to feel: recognition. And that is what stayed with them. Not the pain of war, or the shame of defeat, or even the hunger of the battlefield. It was the moment they realized that the enemy wasn't always someone different. Sometimes the enemy spoke your language, sang your hymns, and carried your name. Sometimes the enemy lived the life you might have lived if only history had chosen a different road.